All right, so let's get started here on our notes. So we're going to be talking about protists, and really we're going to focus our time on a group that's called the Protozoans. So protists, and I think I talked about this before, the Protist kingdom is kind of a thrown together kingdom. Really, scientists that are studying taxonomy probably don't like the Protist kingdom as a group in itself. The Protist kingdom is kind of like a throwaway, like a junk drawer of taxonomy. Like, you know, your house, do you have like a drawer where you put all the stuff that doesn't go anywhere else, like tape and this and that? Well, that's kind of like Protist. You know, taxonomy started out a long time ago with just sort of plants and animals as the two groups. But as scientists learn more about microscopic organisms and learn more about DNA and were able to study it, then they split it up a little bit. So first, fungi got separated out from plants. Okay? Eventually, scientists discovered single-celled organisms, and they were all put together. All single-celled living things were put in the Protist kingdom. But then scientists realized, well, bacteria are really quite different from these other things. They're much simpler, and they don't have membrane-bound organelles in the nuclear membrane, so the bacteria got separated out. Eventually, archaea got separated from bacteria. And what we're left with, protists, is sort of this random group of things that just didn't quite fit into any other group. And so that's why, you know, protists, there's some autotrophs, some are heterotrophs. I know in the past we've said they're unicellular, but there are multicellular types of plankton and things like that that are really multicellular, but are still considered part of this Protist kingdom. So it's kind of all over the place. So we're going to focus, though, on what we call protozoans. These are animal-like protists, things that kind of move around and do stuff, as opposed to the more plant-like protists. So that's what we're really focusing on, protozoans. But if we think about the general characteristics of protists that we studied earlier in taxonomy, we know that protists are unicellular, and I'm putting that in air quotes, because that's not 100% correct. But for our purposes, our simplified version, we're going to say protists are unicellular. They are eukaryotic, meaning they do have a nuclear membrane surrounding their genetic material. And there are some protists that are autotrophic, some are heterotrophic, and some can do either. So their nutrition, there are multiple modes of nutrition. And so protists are generally, they're aquatic organisms. Wherever there's water, there's protists probably living there. If you were to take a sample of water from a pond or a stream or something and look at it in a microscope, you probably would find many different types of protists living there. Small, single-celled organisms living in that water. And protists reproduce, and also some protists are parasitic. They can live inside of other organisms. We'll talk about one specific example this week. And protists can reproduce in a couple ways. Asexually, and you'll remember from when we studied living things, asexual reproduction is basically involves how many parent cells or parents? Yeah? Yeah, one. And what are the offspring of asexual reproduction like compared to the parent organism? See it? Yeah, they're sort of just copies. And many protists can reproduce through this method of asexual reproduction called binary fission. So lots of times we'll talk about what words mean, the roots of these words. Binary. You know what binary means? I mean, I'm sure you've heard it. What? Two? Yeah, it means sort of two. Okay? Like, in computers, binary means it's either 0 or 1. There's two choices. Binary solar system. There's two stars, like Star Wars, A New Hope, Tatooine, There's the two suns that are setting there. But that's a binary solar system. There's two stars there that make up that. Binary means two. What about fission? Is there a word that's similar that you have heard of before? Fizz, okay. Yeah, different sort of words. Kara? Fusion. What does fusion mean? If you fuse things, what are you doing? Lena? Combining them. Fission is kind of like the opposite. So what do you think you're doing? Splitting. Yeah, fission means to split. So binary fission is to split into two parts. Basically, when a protist goes through binary fission, it just kind of splits in two. We're thinking about an amoeba. You have an original parent cell. First, the nucleus copies it, is duplicated, because that's where the genetic material is. And then you have an amoeba with two nuclei in it. Then the rest of that amoeba kind of pinches in, splits in two, and we end up with two organisms, two daughter cells. Hello? Okay. So this is binary fission, splitting in two. We have started with one amoeba, we ended with two, but they're identical to each other, asexual reproduction. But there is also another type of reproduction protists can go through that we'll talk about in a little while. For the protozoans that we're going to talk about, we break them up based on their method of locomotion. What does locomotion mean? What's that? Yeah, there's a dance. Locomotion. Where else have you heard a similar word besides dance? Train. A train, a locomotive. Yeah, it means to move. So these are based on how they move. Amoeboids are protists that move using something called pseudopods. Pseudo meaning false, pod meaning foot. Like who's a doctor that a person goes to fix their feet? Anyone know the name of that type of doctor? Foot doctor? It's called a podiatrist. P-O-D means foot. Podiatrist. Pseudopod is false foot. And so these amoeboids, they move by their cytoplasm just sort of oozes forward. They blob along from place to place. Right? They're very flexible cell membrane. And so they just sort of ooze forward. And the one we're going to look at is the amoeba. Now sometimes amoeba is spelled with an O in there, other times it's just with an E. Either one would be correct. I usually spell it with the O. Another group of protozoans are the ciliates. They move using these tiny hairs, there's an amoeba, called cilia. Cilia are tiny little hairs. They're kind of like oars on a boat, and they paddle the protist through the water. And the one we're going to look at is a paramecium. I guess I should say the ones you guys did look at last week. Then there's the flagellates. The flagellates move using a flagellum. Flagellum is basically like a tail, a whip-like tail that pulls the protist through the water. The one we are going to look at is the euglena. And then the last type are the sporozoan. We're not going to look at the sporozoans in the microscope. Okay, they don't really move on their own. They are transmitted from organism to organism. They are often parasites. And the one we're going to talk about is a sporozoan called Plasmodium. Does anybody know what disease Plasmodium is responsible for? It's a very common disease in many tropical areas. Okay. Jake?
Malaria?
Yeah, it causes malaria. Many of you have learned about malaria in English class this year, right? What was that? What were you reading when you learned about malaria in English? Anyone? What was it? What was it?
It was last year. Yeah, it was like,
Oh, it was last year? Oh, I thought it was this year. Oh, what were you reading a book? Okay.
it wasn't for English. It was? Yeah. Oh.
All right, so Plasmodium is a protist that infects a person's blood cells and damages them. How is this parasite spread from person to person? What?
By flies?
Not quite.
Mosquitoes?
Yes, by mosquitoes. Yeah.
My grandpa went to Africa and they have those same mosquitoes there and he had to wear a net
Yeah.
at night when he
Yep.
went to sleep.
Yeah, it's very common in Africa. We're going to learn more about malaria this week. All right, so the amoeboids, like the amoeba, they, like I said, just kind of ooze forward, sending these pseudopods forward, pulling it along. And not only do they move by these pseudopods, it's also how they ingest food particles. Because if there's a food particle nearby, the amoeba just sort of sends these pseudopods around it, they surround it and engulf it, and then that food is actually inside of the amoeba in a tiny little food vacuole. Those pseudopods are used for both movement and ingesting food. And once the food's inside of the amoeba, it's in a food vacuole where it will be digested. In the protists that we're studying, both all of the amoeba, the euglena, the paramecium, they're all freshwater protists. Now, if you remember back to when we talked about osmosis and diffusion, what happens to cells that are just in fresh, pure water? Think about osmosis. What happens to cells in pure water? Yeah? They swell up. Remember, water goes from a high to low concentration, so water is always moving into them. And so they could swell up, they could burst. So these protists have an organelle that helps them to deal with this. And it's called the contractile vacuole. And the contractile vacuole is just, you could think of it as like a pump. It fills with water and pumps out any excess water that comes into the cell. It's kind of like you may have in your basement at home a sump pump, that if water starts coming into your basement, the sump pump turns on and pumps it outside, so your basement doesn't flood. Well, it's the same kind of idea. This contractile vacuole pumps out excess water from inside of the cell. Okay, the ciliates. The ciliates move using cilia, these tiny little hairs. And they're kind of like little oars on a boat, paddling it through the water. The one we look at is a paramecium. Paramecium is often described as slipper-shaped. It's kind of shaped like a footprint. You can see surrounding these paramecium are all these tiny little hairs. Those are the cilia. Here's an actual microscope image of one. And the paramecium does not have the soft, flexible cell membrane like the amoeba. It has an outer sort of shell called the pellicle. It's this hard covering around the outside. So it can't change its shape very easily. So it can't just surround and engulf its food like the amoeba could. Instead, it has some specialized parts that help it to take in food. And the first part is this area here. sort of an indentation that's lined with cilia. It's called the oral groove. You can think of it as sort of the mouth of the paramecium. The cilia move, pulling in small food particles. And then at the end of the oral groove, this is sort of a tube that leads into the paramecium, kind of like its esophagus. It's called the gullet, leads into the paramecium. And at the end of that gullet is a little vacuole where this food ends up. The paramecium also has an opening that it's used for getting rid of waste. It's called the anal pore, for the removal of waste. And you guys saw these the other day in class, and if you notice them swimming, they swim with this sort of corkscrew motion where they're sort of spinning as they swim through the water. So this is the paramecium. And then the last one for us to talk about is a flagellate. A flagellate swims using this whip-like tail. It's a long sort of hair. And it spins around. And it pulls the protist through the water. The one we're looking at, and you looked at last week, was euglena. When we looked at the euglena, it was the one up here in the green. The liquid looked green. And it looked green because euglena have what in them? They have chloroplasts. Okay, they are photosynthetic. They're autotrophs. They can make their own food through photosynthesis. Okay, so the flagellum moves them. And they can either, if there's light available, the euglena will go through photosynthesis. If there's not, it can also ingest food particles. So it could be a heterotroph, could be an autotroph. It depends on the conditions. So the parts, flagellum is important. That's what pulls it through the water. The chloroplast, the green organelles inside of it that help it to make food through photosynthesis. And also up here near the flagellum is an organelle called the eye spot. Now it's not like an eyeball, they can't see an image, but it is an area that is sensitive to light. And so the euglena knows which direction it should swim in to get into the light so that it can go through photosynthesis. All right, so let's talk about the parts of these protists. First, what is the name of this one? What are we looking at? Jake?
Amoeba.
That's an amoeba. Yes. Okay, so again, its shape is sort of random. It's flexible, changes. Okay. So A, this little area here, can you guess what that would be? What part is that? This might be some food particles that it had ingested in the past. Lucy? Yeah, that's a vacuole. That's a food vacuole. And again, all of these protists that we're talking about are single celled. What part do you think B is, if this is a single cell? H? That's the nucleus, correct. And what fills up most of this amoeba? Colin?
Chloroplast.
A lot of people will confuse these two.
Chlorophyll.
No? Remember those C organelles that people always mix up?
Oh. Cytoplasm?
Yes. Cytoplasm. And then finally, these areas where the cytoplasm kind of oozing forward. Well, the whole outside is the cell membrane, but the areas that get sent forward, those are the pseudopods, those false spheres. Okay, which protist is this? Lena? Yeah, paramecium. Again, it's shaped like a shoe. Think about like you buy a pair of shoes, and then invent a brand of sneakers called Mesium. So then you can buy a pair of Mesium. I even designed the logo on it.
Oh, because that kind of looks like a shoe, too.
Yeah, that's what I just said. Thanks. So anyway, along the outside, what are these tiny little hairs? Here's my logo for my Mesium shoes.
Oh, I like it.
Yeah? I'm still working on it, Bob.
You actually.
Yeah. What are these tiny little hairs? Yeah?
Cilia?
Yeah, those are the cilia.
What type of shoes are you doing? Like running shoes? Like dress-up shoes?
No, I can be like casual, like everyday,
Do you have a clothing brand, too?
I don't know, let's just
Like
take it
a
one thing at a time, Colin. First the sneakers, then the clothing line. All right, so how about B? Well, actually, let's move on to C first, because we'll do this in order. So C, this indentation here. Would this be a good name for a band? Lena?
The floral.
Yes, the oral groove. So that's where the food enters. The cilia bring in food particles. Then it moves down through this tube. That's the gullet. And it ends here. It's not labeled, but what would this tiny little thing be here? Yeah, that's a vacuole. That's where the food ends up. These two things here, the paramecium has actually two nuclei. One is called the macronucleus, that bigger one. One is called the micronucleus, because paramecium can reproduce sexually. Two paramecia can sort of swim up next to each other. They get connected with this tube, and they exchange micronuclei. So one tiny little nucleus from one paramecium they exchange that, and so they transferred some DNA between two different paramecium. So the macronucleus is responsible for all of the sort of general activity. The micronucleus is responsible for reproduction. Okay, how about E? The filling here. See it? Yeah, that's the cytoplasm. This little circle here, that is the anal pore. And then this thing looks like a star. That's the contractile vacuole. Those arms of the star bring water into the central area, and then that contracts and squeezes and pumps the water out. Okay, and our last one. Which one is this? Kira? Euglena. Helps you remember, call it Euglena, because this one's the one that's green.
Kind of looks like a computer mouse.
Yeah.
Right, too?
I don't know.
A computer mouse in there, too.
I just say one step at a time. Just got to build my empire out a little bit. All right, so this long tail, what do we call that? Jake?
Flagellum.
Yep, flagellum. This little tiny spot near the flagellum that is sensitive to light. Gauge? Eye spot. If this were in color, C, all of these would be green because they represent which organelle? Holly?
Chloroplast.
Chloroplast. D. Another organelle. Jake?
Nucleus.
That's the nucleus. And then the star-shaped one. See it? That's the contractile vacuole, yes. All right, that's where we're going to end for today.